Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We're reporting this week from Scottsbluff, just one of many dry areas in the state. We're also coming to you from the Scottsbluff National Monument. Among other things, this area was a landmark to travelers moving on the Oregon and California trails. This landscape in the Panhandle is drastically different than it was when we visited in May of last year. Precipitation then wasn't a concern, and flooding was. But few areas of the state are immune to dry conditions this summer. On Monday, Nebraska Governor Dave Heineman declared a state of emergency due to current drought conditions. The governor also directed the State Department of Roads to advance the starting date for roadside haying in 55 counties. When broken down by district, the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service has every part of the state below normal in precipitation. The closest to par is east central Nebraska, which stands at 94% of normal since April 1st. The driest area is the Northwest District at 45% of normal. This panhandle has averaged a little over an inch of rainfall per month since April 1st, and grass fires are now becoming commonplace. In fact, the haze in the area today is smoke from a fire or fires in the west. Our coverage on crops and livestock this week spans from North Platte to Scottsbluff. We should mention at the time of this taping there are chances of rain that may prove true by airtime. Our hog marketing analyst this week is Ron Plain from the University of Missouri. We talked with Ron on Tuesday afternoon as markets shut down for the July 4th holiday. As dry conditions continue to fuel grain markets, we asked Ron about consumer demand, increasing input costs, and how hog prices can keep up.
June was a pretty good month for hog producers. Prices moved up dramatically. We had a pretty disappointing April and May, but strong prices in June. We got carcass prices above $1 a pound for several days. So yes, a very good month.
With what we're seeing though in those grain markets, Ron, how good do hog prices have to be?
I'm afraid a lot better than they're going to be. With corn prices, the way the futures market's set up now, we're probably going to need close to 70 cents a pound. On a live weight basis, that's up above $1 a pound on a carcass weight basis to cover cost of production. So high-priced corn and high-priced soybean meal is going to make it tough for break-evens on hog farms.
And are we looking at that not even this year, but also into 2013?
Absolutely. Here in early July, we've got the July 2012 corn futures contract above $7. Looks like we may have to wait till the fall harvest of 2013 to get below $6. So we're going to see a lot of break-evens in the 65 to 70 cents a pound live range for hogs, and I'm afraid not all that many days with hog prices that high.
And is that on both sides of the cut there, Ron, for the producer and the packer?
Yes. For packers, hog numbers are going to stay fairly tight, and packer margins are likely to remain tight also. The one thing that is kind of going well for packers is we're exporting a lot of the product. Close to 25% of the pork we're producing is getting exported, and usually packer margins are a little bit better on the exported product than on domestic sales.
You look for those exports, those strong exports, to continue?
Well, to some of the foreign buyers, yes. Mexico, Canada, Japan probably going to continue to be strong buyers. We put a lot of pork into China in the second half of 2011. Looks like their hog numbers are up and they're likely to slow down their purchases. Also, South Korea is probably going to buy a little bit less pork in the second half of this year than they bought in the second half of last year.
For a long time, we were looking at numbers to see if there would be any expansion, and the numbers have been small. With what we're seeing in grain prices and a short corn crop, which could possibly come if there's no rain over most of the corn belt in Midwest, is there any threat that there's going to be contraction now?
Well, there might be, Jeff. USDA's June hog and pig report indicated farrowings in the next 6 months might be down a little bit over 1%. It's not growth there, and that survey was taken in early June. Things have only gotten worse for hog producers, so if the drought continues to spread and corn prices continue to move high, we're going to have pressure on producers to cut back on the breeding herd.
What are you looking at as we go forward in consumption? We're at the July 4th holiday, and beef is going to be tight as well. So how do you see that battle playing out?
Yeah, well, fortunately for hog producers, record high beef prices is likely to continue to make pork look like a bargain in the meat case. Seasonally, we tend to see hog weights decline with the hot weather. That helps boost hog prices also and pork prices. Bacon does real well during late summer once we get into BLT season. So pork demand, I'm hoping, will continue strong. The other thing is gasoline prices are falling. That's also usually good news for pork demand.
And quickly, Ron, in slaughter weights and slaughter numbers, what are we seeing there?
Well, hog slaughter during June dropped down close to year-ago levels. At times was a bit below. The mild winter and early spring, we probably moved some of those hogs to town a little bit sooner. Growth rates were very good in early spring. But with this kind of hot weather, pigs aren't going to eat very much. They're not going to grow fast. We're going to slow down sales. USDA indicates that July and August hog slaughter could be up 1% or so, but that's a pretty modest increase. We're going to see a fairly tight supply of pork, I think, for the rest of the summer.
Next week, Roy Smith will join us to analyze corn and soybean markets. During our trip to North Platte and Scottsbluff this week, we drove by many pastures and rangelands. Many of the forages in these areas were brown and mostly dormant. These low-quality forages may require cattle producers to reanalyze their grazing management plans. Market Journal's Kurtis has the story.
It's hot and dry in Nebraska. Some portions of the panhandle have only received 3 to 4 inches of precipitation since the beginning of the year. The lack of moisture, coupled with consistently high temperatures, is significantly impacting agricultural production systems in the state. Due to the historic weather conditions, livestock producers may need to adjust their grazing plans to maximize pastures and rangelands. University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension educator Aaron Berger says this year's forage production is substantially lower.
Yeah, forage is limited right now for sure, both on a rangeland standpoint and from a haying standpoint. Even on irrigated acres, because of the heat we've had, we're just not seeing these alfalfa and cool season grasses producing like we would in an average year. And so with even the shortage of carryover we had, we're also going to have a shortage of a hay crop this summer, and so forage is going to be tight.
UNL Extension range and forage specialist Jerry Valesky echoes Berger's concerns. Valesky says cool season forage grasses were only 30 to 50% productive this year in the western portion of Nebraska. Many of these forages may be finished producing at this point.
I think we will end up this year, here 2012, well below average in terms of our productivity, and that would even include cases where we do get some rains here during July. We're just getting too far into the growing season to make a significant difference or impact.
While cool season grasses may be finished producing for the year, warm season grasses are also stressed and will deteriorate with heavy grazing, especially in July.
The basic thing is that they are currently under severe stress because of the drought. And then if we excessively graze some of those pastures during July, that grazing is an additional stress for them, and that will, we're going to see the results of that next year too, even if we do have more average rainfall next year. So they do need to be very cautious with their grazing during the month of July in terms of the stocking rates and the level of use they put on the pastures.
Valesky recommends adjusting grazing rotations to reduce the stress on warm season grasses. Ranchers in western Nebraska also have additional grazing opportunities through the Conservation Reserve Program.
We have a lot of CRP acres, and some of those acres have been released recently for grazing. I expect more counties will see those acres released here in the next few weeks. And so we can graze those till late September. And so that provides a grazing option for people that have access to those to try to stretch some forage supplies. And I think that'll be a benefit.
Cattle producers may experience some relief on grazed pasture lands through the utilization of CRP acres and rotational grazing practices, but another viable option exists. University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension Beef Range System Specialist Aaron Stalker says early weaning is one of the best ways to extend the lives of pastures and rangelands. Calves can be weaned as early as 60 days after birth.
If we wean the calf, that reduces the cow's nutrient requirements and therefore will reduce her intake. So she's not eating as much as she would be if she has the calf, and that'll allow us to stay in the pasture longer. The second reason why it's beneficial to early wean is because if we wean the calf and remove him from the pasture, then we're reducing the intake of the calf. So he's not grazing in that pasture anymore. And you know, the bigger the calf gets, the more he eats. So removing him from the pasture can help us save a lot of grass as well.
Adding supplements to lower quality forages is generally not recommended. By adding supplemental protein, cattle could end up consuming even more feed because protein influences the rate of digestion.
If we add protein to the diet, that will increase the rate of digestion, so the feed passes through the rumen faster, and the faster the rumen passes through, the more the animal eats. Okay, so adding protein will increase the intake of the cows.
While supplements aren't recommended to help prolong the lives of pastures and range lands, protein supplements are encouraged if ranchers want to breed their cattle in the late summer. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Kurtis Harms.
Thanks, Curtis. For more information from the experts featured in this piece, you can watch their full interviews at our website, marketjournal.unl.edu, or you can view them on our Market Journal mobile app. Our coverage continues in North Platte with UNL Extension Western Nebraska Crops Specialist Bob Klein. Bob says precipitation in North Platte is 46% of normal since April 1st. But despite the lack of moisture, the corn crop in that area is holding up well.
The corn crop so far in most areas still looks pretty good, but it's running out of water. Yeah. There is some areas, some irrigated areas and so forth where they haven't been able to get water on, planted a high population with no residue. It's running out of water early. But in general, the irrigated corn crop looks pretty good. And the dry land is still pretty good in most situations here, but a lot of it's going to need some soil water or precip before long.
What's helping the corn right now get along? You mentioned residue, and residue's making a big dent.
Yeah, the biggest thing is crop residue to help these dryland crops. Some research that we did here at North Platte a few years ago showed that in irrigated corn on bare soil, 35%, over a third of the crop water use was in evaporation. With good crop residue from like wheat stubble, we can reduce that all the way down to 15%, or that's a 20% saving in crop water use.
The corn that's not doing well in this part of the state, or any part of the state for that matter, and if farmers are thinking about chopping it, what do you recommend? What are some things to keep in mind?
Yeah, one of the things is I always tell our people out here that crop residue is so important in trapping snow, reducing wind velocities and so forth, and helping us collect moisture for the next crop. Out in this area, the normal practice would be after corn is to fallow it the next year, and we prefer doing it with chemicals instead of tillage, and then plant wheat the next fall. But if you're trying to fallow without crop residues, the soil is really subject to wind erosion and water erosion. So we don't recommend that you cut it for silage. If you positively have to cut it for silage, leave 8 rows every so often to reduce those wind velocities, trap snow, and help out. But in general, that will be awful costly silage and so forth, and you'll be ahead just waiting and harvesting any grain if there's any grain out there, and leaving the crop residue because it's so valuable to you.
And obviously, with forage prices the way they are going into winter, it could be a very tough decision for those producers.
It could be, and like I say, if you positively have to, leave some out there to trap some snow and so forth.
Moving farther west, UNL Extension Dryland Crop Specialist Drew Lyon talked with us in Scottsbluff on Tuesday about how plants are holding up in the region. Drew said the area's wheat crop even after freezes and ensuing dry weather, will end up around average to slightly above average. As you'll notice, corn in western Nebraska is much less advanced than that in the eastern half. While the corn in the east is already showing tassels, corn here is about knee-high in non-irrigated fields and showing the effects of continued heat.
Well, you go out and look at a dryland cornfield this late afternoon, and it's looking a bit sorry. The leaves are curled up. There might be a bluish color to it, so it's suffering, but it seems to recover during the night, which means that there's still enough subsoil moisture to let it recover. Corn needs rain during flowering and early grain fill, so late July, early August, and that will tell us a lot about how this corn crop's going to do. It could use a rain or two before then to keep it moving along vegetatively, but the real key to dryland corn is what kind of rain we get in that time period, and it's anybody's guess what we'll get during that period of time. That's what makes dryland corn kind of a risky crop for out here. When it works really nice, but there are years where it doesn't work very well at all. This may be one of them.
So not necessarily a major concern right now because there is a chance.
Correct.
That it could come around.
We never know what the weather's going to do around here, but if we stay in this dry, hot mode, it doesn't bode well for the corn crop. But it's still early enough that you can have a little bit of hope and faith that we'll catch some rains and do all right.
Paint the picture for proso millet and the crop out here this year.
Proso millet is probably off. Some people have some good stands, but because it's been so dry and hot, and proso generally isn't planted till late May, early June, and we've been pretty dry since then, our stands aren't as great as we would like them to be. If you can get proso millet up and planted into some good soil moisture, proso millet can do pretty well with just 1 or 2 rains if it's got good moisture at the beginning. So the struggle this year has been getting a good stand of proso millet. It's a small seed, you plant it shallow, and we've had a lot of hot, warm, windy days that have dried out that surface moisture. So if we can catch some rains that even up the stands and then maybe catch 1 or 2 more and having good soil moisture, I think proso will be all right.
You're looking at the sunflower crop as well. I was asking you before when you would normally harvest that, and you said you'll probably need a freeze, so maybe October would be the time frame. How much moisture does that crop demand?
Sunflowers demands a lot of water. The advantage sunflower has is it has a very deep root system, so it can go down and get that water if it's there. So if you're planting into some ground that has good subsoil moisture, sunflowers can really hang in there and do fairly well. They'll, again, need some rain during that flowering and early seed set, but not as critical for sunflowers as it is for corn.
What's their condition this year?
This year, again, they're planted a little bit later, so I think most people have a decent stand of it, and that root will go down and get to moisture as long as there's moisture there to be had. But again, we're going to need some rain. Its advantage isn't so much that it's real water use efficient. Its benefit is it has a really good root system, so if you have good moisture down there, it'll go down and find it.
Moving again to livestock in the area, Carla Jenkins, a UNL Extension cow-calf and range management specialist, talked with us about the options to feed residues and biofuels to cows in confinement and possibilities for planting forages into harvested wheat stubble.
These cows are on a 30% distillers grains, wet distillers grains, 70% wheat straw diet on a dry matter basis. And this is a really good option right now because here in western Nebraska, our grass resources have pretty much run out and hay is very expensive. And so we are limit feeding these cows in confinement. This keeps them off the grass, keeps them from overgrazing a grass resource that we would need for later. And so they're eating about 19 pounds of that mixture a day, and they're maintaining their body condition very well. And these are late gestation cows. In fact, they're calving right now.
Well, how long can they stay on this diet, or do you change the diet once they go into calving or lactation?
And they can stay on it a long time because it's balanced to meet their energy requirements. And what we do with lactation then, because their requirement does increase at that point in time, is we just bump that up to about 23 pounds of dry matter for this 1,100 pound cow instead of the 19 at gestation. And the cows on the further end have already had some calves, and they're maintaining their body condition very nicely, even though they're already in lactation.
Obviously, with the conditions here, no feed is going to be real cheap this year, especially as we go into winter. But is this relatively cost effective?
For western Nebraska right now, even though prices are very high, this is still one of the cheaper diets that we can develop. with our high prices of residues and byproducts and our trucking costs, because we're farther from everything, you include all that in it, we're still feeding these cows for about $1.34 a day in feed costs alone. That's not feeding cost or equipment costs. But if we were to limit feed alfalfa, we'd have to feed a little bit more because it's not quite as nutrient dense, and it would cost about $2.08 in just feed alone. So still a bit cheaper.
A lot of wheat harvest underway in this part of the state. Are there any options that producers have to plant back into it, especially in irrigated ground? I mean, obviously non-irrigated is probably going to be about it for the year, but in irrigated ground, can they plant anything back in to get anything out of it?
Now would be a good time to be looking at options like Sudan grass or some oats to plant those back into the wheat stubble where maybe irrigation is limited, but we can put on just a couple of inches in August and maybe a couple more in September and get that crop up and going, and then by fall be able to harvest a little bit more forage off that same ground, have it sit idle all winter and not affect your spring crop, and it may buy us several more tons of a forage resource we're pretty desperate to get right now.
In March, Market Journal traveled to the Pacific Northwest with the Nebraska Soybean Board. During the trip, we visited the ports of Tacoma and Grace Harbor to see where U.S. soybeans and other grains are prepared for export and shipped internationally. During our recent trip to China, we visited the receiving end of those grains. Kurtis Harms has more.
With over 1.3 billion people, China is looking to feed a growing population. While agricultural production is important to the country, farms are small. Therefore, China must import agricultural products from around the world. The United States is a key supplier of corn and soybeans to China. On June 15th, Market Journal visited the Shanghai Lianyo Group processing facility at Waigaoqiu Port Pudong, which is near Shanghai. The construction of this port began in 2005 and became operational in 2009. At the facility, 2 Panamax ships can be unloaded at the same time. A series of conveyor belts help transport commodities from ships to storage silos. The grain can also be loaded onto smaller ships or trucks, and a railroad is currently under construction. Soybeans make up the bulk of the port's agricultural imports.
Soybean is the biggest commodity we receive here, about 60% out of all. And every year we will receive over 30 big shipments arrival at this port.
The port has its own refinery, and 2,500 metric tons of soybeans are crushed every week. Most of these imported soybeans come from the United States, Brazil, and Argentina. The drought in Brazil has led to increased imports from the U.S., which are typically more expensive. No matter where the soybeans come from, it can take many weeks for them to arrive at the Waigaoqiu port.
If we ship from the South Gulf from the U.S., it takes about 35 days, 40 days from Brazil, and 18 days from North Pacific Northwest.
Quality soybeans are important to the Chinese. The biggest differences in quality between U.S., Brazilian, and Argentine soybeans is in the oil and protein content.
Our ideal product is higher protein, oil, and lower moisture.
In addition to soybeans, China also imports a lot of corn. Corn is currently the second largest Chinese agricultural import after soybeans. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Kurtis Harms.
Thanks, Kurtis. We also want to thank Claudia Chong, who is our interpreter at the port. Claudia is with the American Soybean Association International Marketing in Shanghai. And now to forecast any chances of precipitation over the next week, here's UNL Extension state climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main forecast, let's take a look at the last week. We've seen some very warm temperatures across much of the Central Plains, and some of that heat's now shifted toward the eastern Corn Belt. Consistently seeing highs in the upper 90s to the low 100 to 105 degree range. And of course, with pollination coming on, the concern is whether or not this will interrupt the process, and we'll see some significant yield declines resulting from this heat. And of course, the lack of moisture. That has become a very significant problem, particularly in the eastern part of the state that had seen some semblance of some rainfall off and on for the last month and a half, but nothing that would overwhelmingly take us from the dry to the wet side. And now we're starting to see the repercussions of that as the crop slowly starts to deteriorate due to the heat stress. Now, there are some good signs in terms of temperatures. We should see a briefer cooler down here for the next few days before we start to see a gradual warm up. with the potential for some on-again thunderstorms, particularly as we go through this weekend, and lesser chances we regress through the week. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we have in store as we move through this next 7-day period. And as we go to the upper air charts, the first thing I'll draw your attention to is a large expanse of high pressure system that dominates much of the central plains and the eastern corn belt is now starting to move its way toward the west in response to a trough coming over top of the ridge and flattening it out. And this will help to dig a trough in the eastern corn belt. Now the models are having a little bit of time determining how deep this trough is, and the deeper it is, of course, the much cooler air will move into eastern Nebraska. If this trough doesn't dig as deep, then the conditions are not going to be nearly as cool. But certainly for today, we are looking for highs in the lower 80s across the northwest behind the cold front that has been pushing southward through Nebraska. And we'll be looking at, in the very southern part of the state, we'll be looking at highs in the lower 90s with thunderstorm chances increasing from northwest to southeast over the next 24 hours. And by the time we get to tomorrow, we will see that the trough starts to dig into the eastern corn belt, and high pressure system centers itself well west of Nebraska. So we'll be looking for some cooler conditions, highs in the low to mid 80s across the east, and then across the west we'll be looking more in the mid to upper 80s with again the chance of afternoon thunderstorms as this cold front at the surface tries to push into the central plains. Now as we go into Monday, we're going to see pretty much an elimination of all the precipitation in Nebraska that remains south of us over the high plains region, but we'll still stay with the cooler temperatures. We'll be looking at highs in the low 80s across the east, and as you get into western Nebraska, we'll be looking at highs in the upper 80s to the low 90s. Now as we go into Tuesday, we'll notice that the cool air is still in place across the east with this trough digging into the eastern corn belt. For the western part of the state, the ridge starts to build back into the region, so we'll be looking at highs in the mid 80s across the east to the low 90s across the west. By the time we get to Wednesday, the ridge starts to move a little bit farther eastward. We'll be seeing an increase in temperatures, upper 80s northeast to the mid 90s across the west. As we go to Thursday, it pushes a little bit farther toward the east ridge, so we're looking at a bump up of temperatures to the low 90s across the east to the upper 90s across the west, and pretty much the same thing as we get into Friday. Same type of temperature regime. 8 to 14 day forecast indicates warmer conditions remain in place. And in terms of precipitation, unfortunately, dry conditions are also looking very promising.
Thanks, Al. You can watch any interview from today in its entirety on our YouTube page or on the Market Journal mobile app. Next week, Roy Smith will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. UNL Extension soil scientist Gary Herger will show how different forages hold up in limited moisture, and we'll show you more from our time in China. From Scottsbluff, I'm Jeff Wilkerson. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
A diesel-powered engine on a farm works hard and operates in a grueling environment. Soy biodiesel fuels stand up to the challenge of powering farm equipment, but are also renewable and environmentally responsible as well. The Nebraska Soybean Board is committed to encouraging the use of soy biodiesel to protect the environment and sustain Nebraska's agriculture. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.